Hello and welcome to The Sound Test, a podcast celebration of video game music in all of its forms, from the innovative heyday of 80s chiptune all the way up to the rich tapestries of dynamic orchestral themes that we get today, and absolutely everything in between. Today, we've got another one of my top fives where we hear music from my particular favourite games in one topic. Like last week we did Gangsters, and it was all games like Mafia, Grand Theft Auto, The Godfather, where we interviewed Ken Felton and things like that, so I think you can see where we're going with the top fives. This week, we're doing a puzzle special, which has been a very difficult one to put together, because it turns out that puzzle games, as I'm sure you're all aware, is one of the biggest, broadest churches in the video game world. There's so many different, incredible, beloved puzzle games, and not only that, different puzzle sub-genres and things like that, and I already feel bad about some of the huge titles that I've had to leave out of my relatively small playlist today, and indeed I think entire genres with sub-genres within the puzzle genre that I might be skipping over today. So I have put together one little special thing that will come together right at the end of the show, which is a kind of walk of shame, which is where I'll be listing various games that I feel probably should have made the cut, but just about didn't make the cut. However, we do have absolutely prime tracks to go today, and some of the biggest games within the genre. I just recognise with something this big, it's going to be difficult to satisfy absolutely everybody, and everybody has their own favourite puzzle games. So let's remember, these are very subjective, very personal top fives, and I have included alongside a good few runners-up for good measure. And that's not all we've got for today. Last time when we did the Gangster special, as mentioned, we did have that excellent interview with Ken Felton where he really laid it out on the line about the Godfather video game adaptation. And this week we have yet another great interview to dig into about halfway through the show, and I'm enjoying leaving these things as a little secret, so I won't mention who that is or what that's going to cover until we get to it, and that'll be a fun little surprise for you guys. No Mario in Strange Scenarios this week. I haven't been able to check in with my sources, but I have been promised that there is a big backlog to get to in the future, but I have got a couple of special things for today's puzzle themed show to make it kind of unique in its own special thing. You may have already noticed a little bit of Morse code at the beginning of this show, and allow that to be the one and only hint that I will give you towards a small code, audio only of course, in case you don't watch this on YouTube, that you can put together and bring to me for a special prize, if you are indeed the first one to do so. I have hidden 3 little audio tidbits in today's episode. The Morse code is one of them, and if you can track every single one of them down, and indeed translate them, they all turn into numbers. And whoever is the first to bring all 3 of those numbers to me will get a very special little sound test Christmas present just straight from me, kind of harking back to the old days of the Sound Effects Showdown and when it would actually work towards actual physical prizes. We'll do that again since it's coming up on Christmas, and I enjoyed this little code idea. So as I say, first person to get all 3 of these digits into me will get a very personalised sound test Christmas present. We will talk personally, we'll figure something out, and make it special just for you. So keep your ears pricked. Some are going to be easier than others. There's only 3, but one in particular might be kind of hard. I want it to be a challenge for you guys, but make sure you stay in touch. We'll see how you do with that. And also, another thing to kind of lean into the puzzle aspect of today's show is that I'm not going to tell you what games, as we go through, are in my top 5, or indeed what their respective places are, until we're right at the end of the show. Let's see if you guys can make any guesses. Let's see if you guys can make any notes as we go through, since any regular listeners probably know me and my tastes and my history quite well at this point. I want to see if any of you guys can make accurate guesses as to which of today's tracks in today's playlist actually come from my top 5, and for extra bonus points, of course, if you can get them in the right order. So, shall we just jump into the whole affair then? Lots of great music to cover today, and we've already opened up with an amazing tune from, of course, that was one of the most popular VGM tunes of all time, from Tetris, but it was a remix by Hydelic, in this case from one of those modern Tetris reworks called Tetris Effect. I think we all know that the melody itself comes from an old Russian folk tune called Korubeniki or something like that from 1861, but it's great to hear it remixed. I literally never get sick of that tune, and Tetris itself is obviously such a huge game when it comes to the puzzle genre, one of the earliest, one of the most important, one of the most beloved, and if I'm not wrong, I think it's still in the top 3 best-selling video games of all time, alongside Grand Theft Auto 5 and Minecraft, but that was 2 years ago that I did that research, so God knows what's taken it over by this point. Really great tune to start off today's show, and absolutely had to include some form of Tetris when we're talking about puzzles. But we're going to open up with a kind of esoteric one now, going into the actual show, from Scribblenauts, in this case Scribblenauts Unlimited, which might not immediately come to your mind when you think of puzzle games, but it is absolutely a puzzle game. If you've never heard of Scribblenauts, it's a really interesting and innovative idea, where it's kind of essentially a platform game in setup, but your special power is the ability to open up a notepad that you can write pretty much anything in, like, say, table, coffee mug, and you can get quite esoteric with it, dinosaur, say, and it will appear. And you can do various things with it, and you come across various people who have different problems. They explain their problem to you, and then you have to figure out an innovative way to make them happy with your notepad by coming up with the right object, or even, it gets quite in depth, applying the right adjective. Did I just say abjective? No, adjective to an object. As I say, to please someone. Like, you can make something smelly, you can make something striped, you can make something huge, you can make something invincible. And it's quite incredible just how creative you can get with that game. But at its heart is a puzzle game where it's left entirely up to you to come up with an innovative, unique solution to these strange little problems that keep getting thrown at you. I'm a big fan of the game. It's actually one of my favourites of all time, and I had a great time streaming it just a few months ago. I might have to get back on that because I haven't completed it. Scribblenauts Unlimited specifically, actually, which we're going to hear by David J. Franco, this amazing upbeat tune to kick things off, Hyphen Heights. Lovely way to kick off the show there. Hyphen Heights from Scribblenauts Unlimited, a game that I personally highly recommend. I've put so many hours into that, just having fun and being silly and making things like a rideable Shakespeare, so you can ride around on Shakespeare's back with an ice gun. You can pretty much do anything you like. It's just a complete toy box. I still haven't completed that bad boy because every time I load it up, I just start being silly. So we're going to go from one tune that puts me in an absolutely fantastic mood to another tune that might potentially put me in an even better mood, to be honest, which is Stage 10 from the absolute puzzle classic Lemmings, which in many ways has kind of span off into its own puzzle subgenre of itself. Subgenre of its own. There are so many different Lemmings spin-offs and twists on the genre. Absolute favourite franchise of mine, and one of the first games that I grew up playing on my brother's Sega Mega Drive, and it is the Sega Mega Drive / Genesis version of Stage 10 that we're going to hear today. We all know how much I love that Genesis FM synthesis, and it's an FM synthesis version by Hirohiko Takayama, but this has even more VGM pedigree than that, in that it's actually a version of an old tune by Tim Wright, who's probably best known for his work on the Wipeout franchise. And it's a tune from one of his old Amiga demos called Pugs in Space. Real classic demo, totally beloved. And any long-time Soundtest listeners will know that I have been lucky enough to welcome Tim Wright onto the show and talk about all things Wipeout. But we fit some little chat in at the end about Pugs in Space, simply because this track is an all-time favourite of mine. And it's not even because of that demo, it's because of Lemmings, this game that I grew up on. So glad that it got a new lease of life in Stage 10. Some of you might know what tune is about to kick off right here, right now. If you don't, get yourself ready. Love this tune. An absolutely stupid one, I know, but still a complete favourite of mine. Begin Rat Extermination from Krusty's Super Funhouse. That was specifically from the Super Nintendo version of that game, which I did used to play, but it had various different versions across the platforms back in the day. Music credits that I've tried to look into just give me New Romantic Productions. No idea what that's all about. However, interestingly enough, it does say that the audio programming was done by David Whittaker, who's a VGM classic, and we'll come more to him later on. So, potentially was David Whittaker, but we'll err on the side of caution with this one. Krusty's Super Funhouse. This was a really interesting puzzle game, and one that could be so easy to dismiss, and I think has been dismissed over the years. But I've talked about it on this show in the past. It's a real favourite of mine. You could just look at it and think, it's like a kind of weak Simpsons crappy licensed game that hasn't really got much to do with The Simpsons at all, and it doesn't seem to have anything to do with the world. But put all that to one side for the moment, and what lies within is actually a really cool and innovative and fun puzzle game in which you have to help Claire, Krusty's Super Funhouse, the titular Super Funhouse, of a variety of rats that have infested the building. And if I remember rightly, it's been years since I've played this, and just making this show has made me want to go and play it again. So we're going to get some fuzzy memories, some decobwebbed memories for you right here. But if I remember rightly, the rats would just kind of move in a set path, and you would have to move various obstacles around and try and get them. I might be remembering them falling into an incinerator, which seems a little bit rough. But no, there was like a boxing glove that used to squash them, and that's kind of rough as well. So these rats did not have a good fate in the end. But it could get really interesting with putting together all of these different objects that did different things to the rats and moved them in different ways. I seem to remember that it was full of really cool secret areas. So this is one that I totally want to go back and play again. Probably stream as well, because it's probably one that I'll seriously get my teeth into. I remember about 5 years ago I digged into it again and still loved it. So I've got all the faith that it will stand up to today. But now we've got to go into one that I can't speak with as much passion about because I simply haven't played it. Professor Layton. We're going to hear Professor Layton's theme, and this is a classic. I love this tune, and we've played this before on the show as well by Mahito. Is it Nishiura? We know how bad I am with pronunciations, but I do try. And I tell a lie a little bit, because I've played Professor Layton for all of about 5 minutes, and in those 5 minutes, I had a great time. I mean, how classic is this? I say this kind of thing all the time. And I remember thinking, it was on somebody's DS that I'd borrowed. I'd gone to visit their house or something. They'd let me have 5 minutes on their DS. And I remember thinking, this is so cool. I really love this, and I wish I had a DS to play more of this game. I think it's specifically Professor Layton and the Curious Village that this is from. But yeah, one of those things on the backlog that I just simply never got round to. So, got no nostalgia for you here. Just a great tune. Professor Layton's theme.
Let's take the time
Is that today's pick of the week? I don't know. It's certainly a pretty damn strong contender, so we may have to check in on pick of the week ideas by the end of the show. But the game from Seventh Guest, which we just heard there, man, that really got me this week. That's a real favourite of mine. And from a real favourite guest of mine from the podcast, actually, the Fat Man, George Sanger, and Team Fat, including people like his brother, Joe McDermott, and Robert Harrison on vocals. Absolutely love George Sanger. Is featured in, I think, 2 sound test podcasts so far, and there's still more to come when I can get back on that backlog. And he is such a great man with so much like history within the VGM world and so much to say on pretty much every aspect of video game music. Can't wait to get more of George out into the world, but very, very glad to share the game there, which, as I said, just totally grabbed me by the throat this week. And unfortunately, Seventh Guest and its sequel, 11th Hour, I believe, is something that I've never played either, released well back in 1993, so I was but 3 years old. Real big CD-ROM innovator, this game. It was one of the first games to be distributed on CD-ROMs as opposed to floppy disk, and as a result could take some pretty big jumps up in music that games previously found it pretty difficult to make. And actually, this game had a separate CD which included like 30 minutes, a 30-minute music track, if I'm not wrong, which you could play alongside the game, which featured this track of the game. And so there's lots of actual innovation going on there and proving what I think about George the Fat Man Sanger, why he's so great, because he always wants to push forward. He always wants to do more and never sees video game music as just this background thing, just kind of like warbling as you get on with the actual game, as a lot of developers saw video game music to be in the early 90s and the 80s. So it's thanks to great musicians like George Sanger and in my own neck of the woods, Rob Hubbard, that actually pushed for this stuff to be great for its own sake. We owe a lot to these people, we really do. So even though I can't talk too much about Seventh Guest, which was, I believe, a kind of point-and-click puzzle-based game, I can talk a lot about George Sanger himself. But that brings us directly into a game that I'm kind of worried how much I could talk about this one, actually. Such an utter favourite of mine that it is. So I'm going to have to try and stay relatively quiet about Braid. And again, long-time listeners should know this. Long-time listeners are probably sick of Braid, I'd be willing to say, because throughout the song fight, didn't one tune from Braid just keep coming up over and over again? That's never a bad thing, though. But this time, we're going to have a different tune. I don't think I've played this on the show before. I don't think I have. That's why I've selected it. If I'm wrong, whoops. But it's Downstream by Shira Kamen. Absolutely lovely, lovely tune. And if you haven't played Braid, I'll give you a quick synopsis without falling into a 3-hour lecture about the damn thing, which is it's mostly about time. Mostly turning time backwards and certain objects that kind of live outside of time, so you can manipulate with them in that way. And it's just really one of the most intelligent and mind-expanding video games that I have ever played. I genuinely feel like a more intelligent person having played it. I feel like that game did more for me than university. So if you haven't played Braid, go get yourself on Braid. It's an absolute classic. Do not look up any spoilers on the ending, because it's got one of the very best video game endings of all time. But I'll try and stop myself short there before I really fall into a Braid lecture and all of its various amazing philosophies. Lee, stop. Stop yourself. And let's just listen to Downstream by Shira Kamen. Downstream from Braid there, one of my favourite games of all time. But to this day, I still question whether I might prefer its semi-sequel, The Witness, also developed by Jonathan Blow. And if I haven't been too lazy this week, there should be a new stream up on my YouTube of me playing The Witness. Reason being that this is going to lead into my big interview this week, which I have been super excited about, because The Witness is one of the most fascinating games when it comes to audio of all time. The game itself, as a quick synopsis, mostly consists of kind of panel puzzles where you try to get from one end to the other, which kind of sounds basic, and this game was tough to put across in trailers. But it's like just so expressive and so interesting and does so much with the form that might be my favourite puzzle game of all time. Like, honestly, the things that does to your mind as you play through it are completely and utterly unique, and I've got so much respect for what Jonathan Blow did with that game. But I've also got so much respect for what Andrew Lackey did with that game, the game's sound designer, with these difficult constraints that The Witness had, which was to have basically, outside of one challenge, absolutely no music, and to rely entirely on its ambient audio and sound design. And to make things even harder, he couldn't even include anything like bird chirps or things like that, because the island on which it's set was completely free of wildlife. So he had to do some really interesting things to make sure that the game still had this big or rich audio tapestry that captured the player and enhanced the game and pulled you into the puzzles and helped you feel like you were solving the puzzles. And Andrew and I are going to cover all of that right now. So glad to welcome Andrew onto the show to discuss that incredible project. So how are things going today then, Andrew?
Very well. Eventful.
Or should I go with Andy? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I go by Andy. Yeah.
Easy for me, same name as my dad.
Oh, how about that?
Yeah. So obviously this conversation's going to be about The Witness, but I thought we could start out talking a little bit about Wabi Sabi Sound itself, who have provided audio to franchises like BioShock, Left 4 Dead, Team Fortress, Skylanders, more recently huge titles like Horizon Zero Dawn and Destiny. But before we get into The Witness, yeah, could you talk a little bit about how Wabi Sabi Sound began and grew into what it is today?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I've been doing this type of sound work in films and video games prior to Wabi Sabi Sound. So I was in Los Angeles for a number of years working in films and moved up to San Francisco and doing the same thing. And as EA started to get into more IP titles like Lord of the Rings and etc. and The Godfather, they were looking for film designers who were also interested in exploring the video game space. Um, so I after about, I don't know, 8 or 9 years with EA, I kinda had this, sort of broad experience of doing, design and mixing and then, game, development and implementation. So around, around that time, I just saw this opportunity to kind of take all of this that I had learned and all these just wonderful experiences that I had had working with incredibly creative smart people in both the Los Angeles film community and the Skywalker film community and the EA gaming community and bring that out to a boutique smaller company that's accessible to all of the really interesting types of companies and projects that are happening at the smaller scale. So, um, and this was 13 years ago. It was actually on October 31st, Halloween, almost exactly 13 years ago that this this actually all went into play. And yeah, from early on, we had some interest, as you mentioned, from like really big companies who were looking to who were looking to kind of enhance their existing teams and expand their capacity through maybe doing cinematics or assets, but also those smaller companies that were looking to really kind of take audio to that next level, really kind of leverage um, more of the blockbuster slash AAA type production values, saw us as a great way to scale with them, because we were, of course, much smaller, and we could partner with them. And that's really kind of the story of meeting John for The Witness, and also working with the Moon team for Ori and the Blind Forest and several other smaller teams. And in fact, that's I would say mostly what we do at this point is working with smaller teams with huge ambitions, and really being on that full development journey with them.
And you have Wabi Sabi Sound have crafted the audio for many beloved games, but The Witness is probably one of the most unique and fascinating in the whole thing. And outside of one challenge, it actually features like pretty much no music, which is kind of one key feature of its soundscapes and ambiences. And was the decision to take this approach already in place with Jonathan Blow when you came onto the team, or was it something that you helped to work out?
It's super interesting that this what you're asking about is maybe one of the most interesting 30 minutes of my professional career, because and I'm delighted to tell this story because it's just something I have very fond memories of. But I met John through a friend who I had worked with on a project at the EA, and then through this friend, hey, I've got this friend that's doing this sequel to Braid. I was like, oh wow, Braid, that's an awesome game, and we lived. I lived in Oakland. He lived in San Francisco, which is just across the bay from San Francisco, and took the train in and met John, for the very first time at a coffee shop. I can even remember it's called Muddy Waters, on Valencia there in San Francisco, in the Mission. And we sat down, and really it was really my first, you know, meeting with John. We had a couple of email exchanges, but it was, him and his laptop, and, us with a couple of cups of coffee. And he started showing me the game, but like right off the bat, that was the first thing he said, that the the experience of the game is very, very particular, in that um what you how you go about understanding what the game is as a player is very much determined by your own perception of what you're experiencing in the world as you move through it. And so he understood very, very early on that, from very beginning, or before I was even involved in the project, that introducing anything superfluous to the game itself was going to be very problematic for players, because anything could be a hint or a mechanic to play the game, anything visually. And it turned out, um so anyway, I'll get back to this point. But so he said, you know we there won't be any music in this experience, because there is a literal nature to the game that's absolutely the core gameplay mechanic, that if there's no orchestra sitting in the sky anywhere, so therefore there's no music, right? So everything and in part this was, I think, why I was um alluring to him to partner with on the audio, because my core skill set and really creativity kind of comes in this, like, sound design, organic, kind of creating a world and creatively furthering narrative through the use of sound. So I was like, okay, interesting. So I was like, but of course, like, I couldn't be totally satisfied with that answer. I was like, okay, but what if because not only was it music, but he said also no wildlife, no animals, there's no crickets, there's no birds. I was like, "Okay." So I'm just thinking, I'm, like, immediately, like, ideating sonically in my head around, like, "Okay, well, what" I'm looking at this and I'm like, "Okay." And in the games also, he's explaining about the puzzles and how people find them and et cetera, and I was like, "Okay, but what if what if, like, you did hear a bird tweet, like, there's no like, you don't hear anything like that, but, like, you kind of wander into the woods, and again, this is, like, total programmer art, there's nothing built about the game to speak of, just a very basic, like, the first house that you start the game in, and a little bit of the courtyard area, and then just the rest of it was kind of just an unpopulated island at that point. And I was like, "What if you heard the bird and you're like, "Oh my god," that would be pretty striking for people to all of a sudden, like, after playing the game for a half hour, like, "What's that?" Like, "It's weird." And then you're kind of, like, following it, and then, like, it turns out that it's not actually a bird, it's, like, a speaker, you know? And and it was funny because I saw him pause for just, like, a moment, and to know John, he's a very cerebral person. Certainly if you've ever watched any of his videos or his talks, you see, like, he's a super deep thinker and very, principled in his design and his, how he, thinks about things. And I don't think I got much of a reaction about it from him, but there was a pause. And then, we kind of went on, I think think that internalized a bit from him. And I go on and, um, we finish up the meeting and there's some interesting other story there too. But, um, about 4 weeks later, he's like, I did this thing, and it was like the speaker with the bird and the whole thing." He put in a speaker, he's like, "Let's try that idea." So, um, and 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 in fact, I mean, what the bird puzzle does, if you've played the game, the bird puzzle is one of the kind of more basic ones you find, um, eventually, is that, we ended up not just doing the bird, but it's the puzzle's kind of a melody seeking puzzle, right? Like, you're kind of trying to map the pitch of the bird. So in that sense, I think there's an argument there's a melody there that that's, like, slightly musical, or at least in the very primitive sense of, human development and what we think of as music is maybe in the very primary sense. There's a tiny bit of of score in the game. Yeah.
Well, I'm a musician myself, which is one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated in game audio and game soundtracks and everything. And it's funny you should say that because that section of the game did kind of stop me in my tracks, and I really felt like I was being spoken to with that section. Like certain sections kind of like lean more into like mathematical kind of solutions and everything, but with that section I really felt, no, this is for me. And it felt like melodies, definitely.
Yeah, and I have my own kind of perception of why I think that the game is brilliant. And it really speaks to that. Like, I think players of all different backgrounds and kind of physical, mental capacities, some of these things are just gonna be like, "Whoop, yeah, no problem," like, "Oh, like, melody puzzle, like, this is cool," I play violin or piano or whatever, like, I'm totally comfortable here, I'm gonna own this, and then it might get to, like, the hydroponics farm where it's, like, all about colors and how the colors blend together, and it's like, well, I'm kind of wondering how many people discovered they were colorblind because of those puzzles, so I think there's, and again, as you're saying, there's logic, there's spatial memory, spatial skills, etcetera, there's just in some cases, there's really physical, navigating through a space in an amount of time kind of thing. So yeah, I agree. I think the game is really brilliant in the way it challenges people, and in some ways that's like, oh yeah, this kind of works on a intellectual level that I already have some strong capacity in, um, and in other ways not. And I think it's also pretty unique in the way that it strips down so much of like what is common for games and really puts that sort of perception and mental logic and using your sensory, your capacity that you have to solve puzzles and experience the game for what it is.
Yeah, and the game can teach you a lot, and it leans into something I've heard Jonathan Blow talking about how a lot of the magic of the game is actually happening inside your own head rather than on the screen. And the audio definitely plays into that, and it's this really immersive, incredible environment. And one thing I wanted to talk about is one way you made that so organic and blend so well as you work around the island and its various different areas is you actually used the real life island, Angel Island, as a model. I think you described it as a kind of Sonic model uh, for the in-game island itself. It was kind of surreal to look at to me, actually, because it's not exactly like the island, but it's very, very close. To know there's kind of a real analog there. So, as an audio designer, I thought we could dig a little into your process of walking around this island, making different sounds. How do you go about it? How do you select when something's right, and then what's your process after that?
Yeah, and thanks. Yeah, and so you're setting me up perfectly because on the way home from that, fated coffee meeting with John, of course, my mind is just going in every which direction on how, keep in mind like the projects I'd done just before that were like Dead Space and Spore, and we're just making these like absolutely crazy fantastical kind of like worlds, and then here we are making like an incredibly deep and focused world, and it's antithetical to really like having years and years and years of other projects that I had done, so my mind is just going crazy with all this. And again, like between sort of sitting in the bay between San Francisco and the East Bay and the Marin areas, yeah, this island that's basically it's kind of neighbors to Alcatraz Island, that's really kind of preserved as a natural habitat. So it's really very quite easy to get there, but it's basically a hiking and history museum, if you will. Um, and that it was yeah, but anyway, so I can't remember if that was kind of the point when I was kind of coming home, but I definitely was like, this is going to be so tricky to really create a lengthy, really deep, rich experience. Effectively, 90% of it is going to be very textural air. It's just going to be a lot of textural air, which is the most kind of basic form of ambience, I guess you could also describe it. But then also footsteps and how your feet and the things that you touch are gonna, like, really basically define the sound of the game. Um, that's 95% of what you're gonna hear playing it. So, I think, getting back home, I tinkered a little bit, with different sounds, but it took me, like, almost no time at all to just realize, like, the amount of, um the large degree to which Foley, particularly footsteps, was gonna be heard, w w and not only that, but, like, the visual, when you look at the surfaces of the world, oftentimes in a game, you can get away with maybe 6 or 8 types of footsteps. It's like, oh, we have our grass and we have our snow and we have our dirt and we have our cement and that's it, right? Like you can kind of make that work. The footsteps kind of are more felt than heard, if you will. But in the witness, it's like that, like you're actually going, like you're going to know a lot about the world through the footsteps themselves. And I know you asked about ambiances, but it's all related. Um, so so once I was like kind of realizing like footsteps are really it's not going to be as categorical, in this game to do it well. They really need to blend. They need to change uh gradually as you move from surface. There's never a rarely is there a dirt path, that just is then grass. A lot of times the grass is growing a little bit, especially if it's unkept and, kind of this wild island like the Witness Island. So, we so as I was like digging through libraries and stuff like that, and again, I have a huge sound effects library. I love recording. We mostly do all of our sound effects for games like within our own library. We don't use commercial libraries hardly at all. But once I started digging through, I was like, if I pull a little bit of sound here and a little bit of sound there, well, this I recorded, while I was camping, you know, up at, Kings Canyon. And this I recorded 3 years later at some other, camping thing. And this I record. It's like these things they're not they don't match. Like this is just not like going to work on the level of detail and granularity that it's going to be necessary to blend these things. So I was like, okay, I got to like I'm gonna have to do a massive recording session. Like I'm just gonna have to just redo this fresh. And then once you're on that train of thought, it's like, okay, well, if I'm gonna do that, um, you start thinking about locations, you start thinking about the surfaces you need, you start thinking about recording techniques that you would use. Again, like here we have a first person visual and you're hearing the footsteps from underneath you. So there's some idea around that. And then, as I'm doing that, I was like, well, I'd really like to do this organically, but then I have to deal with all of the, the ambiances. Typically footsteps are done in a studio, although I love using live recorded footsteps from out in the field. But then I was like, well, that part's a little bit on the easier side because we can kind of have this mush of air because it's all one location. So then I just like, well, it really doesn't matter if I record all the footsteps like in a place that has like the same type of ambience, then I can accept some degree of like ambience actually in the footstep sounds themselves, and I can record the ambiences of the place. So anyway, it just kind of finally dawned on me. It's like, if I just did this whole thing where I recorded all of the footsteps and all of the ambiences on this one island, they'll obviously automatically mesh together, right? So that makes that a lot easier and also have this continuity that will really play well with the game. So yeah, then it was just a process of like going out there 3 or 4 times and the place is a great place because it's got not just like dirt and grass and all that, but it's got actual docks and different types of surfaces, metal plates and weird stuff like that. So it ended up being just perfect. And I eventually I just like, well, this is my outdoor Foley stage.
And there's a lot of sounds in The Witness that aren't so natural as well, that are also very, very important. And I kind of think of these as essentially like marking your work as you go through. Like through the audio, you know if your answer is right or wrong. And because of that, it's an intensely satisfying game to slowly solve through. And I'm thinking about things like the positive reinforcement of panel sounds as you get things right, the delightful crunching of mechanisms when you operate them, and this is a specific one, that huge booming victory that comes when you discover a very special type of puzzle that I'm keen not to spoil for anyone who hasn't played the game. So how do you craft these sounds that in many ways act as rewards for the player?
Well, I think the first point to make there is that when you have a baseline audio sort of treatment for really a film or a game or anything, and then you contrast that with something very different, that delta between um, the baseline and that new sound that you introduce has a huge is hugely important to how it's perceived. So for instance, if the game was already a very like kind of noisy environment with lots of machines and uh, boomy stuff, the the panels and the big things that are happening when the big things happen, that it would not set itself off that much and would not have that same kind of impact for the player. So the first thing in the aesthetic decision making there is to establish a baseline of what the natural world sounds like and really find that balance of like what is not too little because there needs to be something there that just supports the kind of the experience, right? To hook the player in, to get them immersed in this field, in this world, and have them exciting the brain in such a way that they're locked in, but not going past the point of of doing more that wants to like that's begging the consciousness to pay attention to, right? So once you've got that established, it it really becomes, you really are so free to create from all kinds of elements, because you've got all this sonic space to work with. It's almost like if you're going to paint a beautiful painting, if you've got a white canvas, it's incredibly rich to throw red on there. But if you've already got purple and you throw red on there, it's not going to do as much, right? So you've got this great open kind of format to do all kinds of interesting things with, and really um do very satisfying, uh, rich, clunky, if you will, effects, but also layer in subtext and, interesting things that kind of, polish it and make it unique and feel very appropriate for the type of puzzle that you're doing, or do subtle things that feel rewarding or not as rewarding. So yeah, I think to that degree, like creating that rich organic space that gets people in there, but then contrasting it is a huge portion of it. And again, the challenge there too is without spoilers, we're not just talking about bird puzzles for audio. There's more in there to discover and to learn about the world through the audio itself. So it actually becomes like a core gameplay mechanic that you've got, a baseline that people are comfortable with and they understand, but then also the threshold of like, oh, something new, something interesting just happened, and I need to pay attention to that, is something like that's really like specifically like that's a game design consideration, not just to make it sound cool consideration. Yeah.
And also, there are other places where you maybe get to experiment a little more beyond trying to create an extremely natural, organic sound. And you've actually made little videos yourself, which I was able to watch, showcasing this stuff. One of my favourite examples was in the temple, where you've pole stretched a monk's chant. Um, to create this really incredible sound, ambient soundscape that's very different to anything more natural when you're out around the trees and things like that. So, could you discuss the creativity of creating something like that, and maybe some more examples of that show up in The Witness?
Yeah, great observation there. So we did take more creative liberties with the interiors, and subtle, super subtle. Because again, if anybody like went in there and heard like a monk's voice, it would like absolutely would not work, right? Because they'd be trying to figure out why there's a monk's voice and trying to figure out the puzzle involved with that monk's voice, so we had to be super subtle with it. But at the same time, the architecture on the island is very, very important to the game itself. And um the the architecture and the environmental design that John and that team and their team did, especially they had are like actual architects working on that as well to really get those spaces feeling organic and real. um we looked for ways to, yeah, impart slight notes, if you will, of what the history may have been, of like why there's a random, why there's a temple here, or why there is uh a windmill, or these kind of it's hydroponic kind of buildings, et cetera, et cetera. It's really up to the player's imagination to draw connections from all these. But certainly we we did um In the case of the interiors, felt like there was a tiny bit of creative license we could do. I mean, I say that having a little bit of, like, anxiety right now of, like, "Oh gosh, we just can't cross that level. We can't cross," but, it's also, um, the but a tool, getting to your specific question, Paul Stretch, and to nerd out a little bit, is an incredible, granular synthesis tool that kind of does the opposite of what pretty much every other granular synthesis tool does, in that it, like, really allows you to, like, stretch things out to its, like, almost like time, to it has this, like, feeling of timelessness, which is very appropriate for the witness, because the playing the game, obviously, there's very little to, like, press you to, like, go to the next thing outside of your own ambition to go and solve another puzzle, right? Like, it's very much like you play the game because you have the will to go and solve the next puzzle. There's no clock, there's no zombies, chasing you. Nobody's gonna shoot you dead, right? So Paul Stretch ended up being an amazing tool, because you can put in a piece of representative content of what might feel appropriate for this space. And just before starting my company, I traveled through Japan and did a lot of recordings in temples, and sometimes there's actual monks chanting. It was just a wonderful experience. So I used some of that material, and then with Paul Stretch, I think I may even took a screenshot of this and twittered it. But I you can kind of, like, mess around with it and, tweak the dials. And I think I had, like, stretched something out that it gives you this readout of how long your resulting file is going to be. And I think I had made a file that was going to be like 1 to the 18th, or power, like, years long or something. It's just some ridiculous number. I was like, oh, might want to redo that. So yeah, and yeah, you put it in, and it's like, that is just, it's so vaguely, it vaguely has that timbre of humanity that really fits for a space like that. Also, this timelessness, this, like, I'm getting this, like, note and this feeling, but but it just feels very static in a kind of warm and comforting way. Especially that feeling, that transition from, like, a natural setting, which has a lot of kind of randomness in it. The noise and the air is a kind of, conceptually very random. But when you move into a space, it feels more ordered, right? And I think that really, um, kind of remarks on, what the architecture was there, and, perhaps the story beneath, like, what maybe had happened, or, some amount of kind of pulling the resources of the island and creating some architecture. Yeah, as far as other examples, I think that one's really, um, pretty pretty great and pretty dead on. Um, it was certainly used, to some degrees, in so the opening tunnel, uh, you might be able to notice there's very, very, very subtle, um, wave crashing sounds in there that are also treated. And that would be because the tunnel, if you look at it, it's physically under, rocks. If you could take a look at the map, or if you kind of could postulate where it might be, it's kind of sitting kind of underneath the rock wall that's sitting by the house. So there's examples of just how we're kind of subtly suggesting, maybe the history or the purpose of a room, or the physical location of a space based on that.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I don't think it'd be too much of a spoiler to say that the one time music makes a prominent appearance is during the final challenge. It's kind of somewhat famous for that, and I've spoken about it on my show as well. Were you involved in this decision at all?
No, not really. Um, so John and I definitely talked about music. We talked about, amongst other things, because we also, voice is also very, very sparing, in the game, but it is there. And so we had various conversations about, these particular moments and how we would, how we would go about them in the way that felt right for the witness. And in the case of the music, really the needle drop takes are really something John kind of made the decision on kind of independently, and I couldn't even really say how he came to those decisions. Um, and we worked with what he had found for that.
Well, just a final question then, because you did mention the audio puzzles and how really you inspired those by mentioning about the following the bird chirping and everything like that. I'm interested in how much further collaboration you might have had with Jonathan throughout the game, because as you mentioned, the audio puzzles do really build on each other, and there are some really fascinating ones, as well as the footstep ones around the castle.
Yeah, and uh, arguably the hardest puzzle in the entire game is an audio puzzle, and um, I don't know if it's spoilers to give that away. I guess if we're just naming the puzzles, but there's a puzzle on a wrecked ship, out on the that kind of on the edge. It's a little bit beyond the castle where the footstep puzzles are. So that that ends up that's an incredibly difficult puzzle, um, and involves ship creaking and the sounds, and the kind of yeah. I'll leave it at that. Um, the collaboration was very um it was very collaborative. So I was involved with the witness probably in excess of 5 years with John's development of it, and that's not to say I was working on it every single day, but but as things went along, it's like, okay, well, let's work on this, and then we would move on to something else, and I was in and out for that amount of time. And yeah, I mean, the collaboration was very rich, very deep. And because as you say, what looks like a 5-minute experience for the bird puzzle sequence or whatever is lots and lots of iteration. I mean, we probably redid those puzzles, I would say, maybe 25 or 30 times. And the reason is that we would do it, and we'd have a strong idea of like, okay, this is work. Like I would do something, I'd be like, okay, this is working, right? And then John would play it, he'd be like, well, it's good, we're getting somewhere, but yeah, I think that it's not clear to me what's going on here. And in the bird puzzle in particular, I would it was actually a little bit challenging to realize, like, okay, well, there's a lot of harmonics in a bird tweet, right? So is it true that you're hearing, the pitch just go up, or is it you're hearing more harmonics stronger, some upper harmonics stronger than other harmonics, like those kinds of like really interesting like discoveries you make. So um and like I would be able to hear that, like, okay, well, a fundamental like pitch and the harmonics have shifted. But if you're not musically trained, it could sound like, well, just the harmonics were more emphasized and they were louder, and that makes it sound higher pitched. You get what I'm saying? So so like all these really interesting conversations I had with John over the years of like, you know, um, okay, I see, I can understand why this puzzle is confusing to you. And of course, like the puzzles have to make absolute logical sense, right? It's the whole basis of the game. And you cannot, force your way through it, or you definitely don't want people to force their way through it, because then they won't understand the skill that they need to solve the next puzzle, right? Like you could force your way through any puzzle and just solve it by trial and error. But when you get to the next one, you're gonna fail because you didn't learn what you needed to learn, right? So so we were very John, again, just in his brilliance, just understood that so well and designed the game exactly to be that way. It's not an accident. That we needed to like really be sure that we were putting correct, putting logically scientific, like very accurate clues in there. So that's stuff that just takes iteration and practice. Of course, I didn't just record the bird and throw it in there and make the puzzle to it. It had to be designed, even though it doesn't sound that way. So and then to kind of just further that point a little bit more, John would do limited play testing with like some of his friends. He'd have them play it, and if they would get stuck on a particular puzzle, even with a little bit of help, of course, that would be our clue that like, okay, we need to work on this a little bit more to make it a little easier or make it, a little more clear what's going on. So when you multiply that by all the puzzles we had, all the ambiances, the ways in which we wanted to really craft people's experiences moving through the world, really have like the richness of like the seasons and the biomes. Even though it's not really biomes, right? No life, but there's deserts, there's woodlands, there's river areas. All of that was just a lot of trial error, lots.
I've always
Yeah.
imagined that Jonathan Blow would be absolutely meticulous, and it's great to hear that the audio followed in those footsteps as well. It's one of my favourite games of all time, and it's been an honour to speak to you about it. Thank you, Andy.
Well, thank you so much. It's been really wonderful to talk to you, and any further questions from you, the listeners, feel free to email me, Andy at Andrew at Wabi Sabi Sound. Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you so much, and have a good day, Andy.
you too.
Bye for now. What you heard there to cap off that interview with Andrew Lackey was a sample of Witness audio entitled Cypress Forest plus Treehouse, which Andrew has up on his own YouTube, just to show off how rich this soundscape can be. And I've got a couple more samples as well to show off from The Witness, because it seemed a shame to have such a fantastic interview with Andrew covering so many different aspects of that Witness sound, and to not actually hear some of it. So here's another one called Open Field and Eucalyptus Forest, kind of similar to Cypress Forest and Treehouse, but just take a good listen to how well everything blends, and what a completely self-contained sound that the island itself has no matter where you walk. And next up, to finish up our look at The Witness, we're going to hear one of my very favourite examples of sound within that game, and it's something that Andrew and I just talked about, and it's called Temple Exterior and Interior, and it's where you're going to get to hear that incredible Paul-stretched monk's chant. So hopefully after all of that, some of you will now be more intrigued to go out and check out The Witness, which is, as I've said many times over the course of this show, one of my favourite games of all time, and you will be rewarded. And come and let me know, because I always love to go over The Witness and its various different philosophical points, but I'm accidentally going to fall into a lecture again, so I really do need to stop myself. We still have like a good 7 or so tracks to get through on this top 5 podcast, and we'd better get through it. We've also got that walk of shame to get to at the end, so still a lot to chew through. And next up on the show, we're getting into a franchise which, and I feel like I am saying this a lot on this show, and I think it's because puzzle games are so important to me. A franchise that is just absolutely core to my love of gaming and goes completely far back, like to me being about 7 years old, and is one of the most formative experiences that I have ever had in my video game history, something that I shared with my dad. So again, long-time listeners might have been able to work it out by now. We're going to hear something from the Oddworld series, one of the finest examples of puzzle platforming out there, because while of course it relies on well-known platforming tropes like jumping, running around, and getting to the end of the level, it's all about really saving your Mudokan friends who are always placed in extremely difficult scenarios, surrounded by guards, surrounded by meat saws, and you really have to puzzle your way through the game to save every single one of your friends and to slap those industry despots in the face as hard as you can along the way. And it can be really quite challenging, really quite difficult. And some of my favourite gaming memories from when I was about like 7 on through to about 12 was staying up far too late at night with my dad, trying to work out these levels and also helping him out with the controls, because it's just about the only video game he's ever bothered playing, and he never quite figured out the game speak as much as he wanted to. But throughout the sound test hiatus that we've had across this year, a big release has been released that I haven't really been able to speak about because I haven't been doing any shows, and that's the brand new Oddworld game, Soulstorm, which is a kind of reinterpretation of their old game Abe's Exodus, but it's such a huge reinterpretation that it might as well be its own game, and I'm still chewing through that. I really, really like it, and I've got a few things to say about it, but we'll come to that in the future when I've completed it and can kind of give a more rounded opinion. Until then, let's actually hear something from the game. I've never been able to play something from Soulstorm before, so this is very cool. This is by Josh Gabriel, who actually worked on the very original Oddworld Abe's Odyssey as well, so it's really awesome that they were able to pull him back in. And this is a long ambient track, because they were always ambient in the Oddworld, called The Yard. But it's going to build up towards something near the end, and I think this is one of the finest examples of Oddworld ambience that you can get. Slowing things down there a little in the second half of this show, that was Channel Wood Age, H&R's theme, from that classic puzzle game, Myst, composed by one of the game's developers as well, Robin Miller, was developed with his brother Rand Miller. I hope it's brother anyway, because I've never actually played this game and I've had to do rushed research. But Myst is one that I've always been absolutely fascinated by, because they had it for my primary school computers when I was super young, but they would never actually let me play it. It was like, you were too young to play that. And then by the time I was in the right year for it, I think I'd forgotten about it, been distracted by WWF SmackDown 2 or something like that. But yeah, Myst, and it's funny because this is kind of coming off the heels of that big conversation about The Witness. The Witness was pretty heavily inspired by Myst in a lot of different ways, and Myst has been one of the most influential games to the puzzle genre moving forward. It's kind of a first-person point-and-click puzzle game with various different logic puzzles and a really cool central story, because I did read up on it, but still haven't played it. It's had a lot of remasters though, so I'm going to have to remedy that. Moving into another one that I absolutely know nothing about. Well, not nothing about, but I haven't had a chance to go back and actually play it. This is one of my favourite choices for today, called The Sentinel. And old school fans might know exactly what I'm talking about here. This was a big Amiga game, or what we're going to play is from the Amiga. It was also on the BBC Micro and a lot of those old consoles. Really awesome puzzle game from back then and completely innovative, and I've never really heard of anything like it since. It's almost impossible to describe, but I'm going to have a kind of fair whack at it. Essentially, you play as a kind of robot, and it's in really advanced 3D scenarios actually for back in the time, and you've got to try and get yourself to the highest level of the world that you're in, because it's like kind of mountainous environments and hills and things like that, where on that highest level there is the Sentinel, I believe, that is actually looking for you all the time, and if it can see you, it drains energy from you. So you have to make your way around the map systematically with a strange set of different moves that you can make. Like you can create blocks, I think, and you can transport your robotic personality into a clone of yourself to move around the map. It's really strange, and I'm trying my hardest to describe it, but I promise it is one of the most interesting puzzle games of all time, and I got completely lost in watching playthroughs of this for about 3 hours just a few nights ago. Check it out. It's so distinctive, so unique, and it has a really cool soundtrack by David Whittaker, with the Amiga version, that is. And we're going to hear the very first variation of its in-game BGM here, which has just that lovely Amiga synth sound. Check it out. BGM11, a nicely inventive track name there from the artist Twice a Man, actually a Swedish electronic artist there, from one of my favourite puzzle games of all time. And again, I'm saying that throughout this show, but that's going to happen with top fives, isn't it? Cooler World, otherwise known as Rollaway, and there's actually a little mini let's play of this on my YouTube channel if you want to check it out, because this is another game that's really hard to describe, which happens a lot in puzzles, it has to be honest. So check out this let's play of me and Dale playing through Cooler World and getting super nostalgic, because this is going to make little sense, but I'll try my hardest. Essentially, you play as a beach ball, and you have to make your way around blocky environments floating in the air whilst picking up fruit and avoiding spikes. I mean, it kind of makes sense that a beach ball would want to avoid spikes, but I don't think there's ever been any attempt to give that a kind of narrative framework or a spine behind Cooler World that'll make any of it make sense. No, you're a beach ball. You gotta collect the fruit, you gotta collect the keys, you gotta get to the exit. It's just that simple. And hey, it results in one of the finest puzzling experiences that I have ever had, and it can actually be really mind-bending because it involves a lot of like turning a shape around in space and like imagining where you can go along the path of these strange geometric shapes floating in space. It's a very, very cool game, and I've talked about this on the show before, but I'll repeat myself to an extent. It was one of those games that was on a PS1 demo disc, and that I played to death on the PS1 demo disc and could never actually locate a physical version of the game in any of my local game shops. And it wasn't until emulation years down the line that me and Dale, who also played the hell out of that PS1 demo, could finally get our teeth into the game and discovered it's actually a really challenging, really clever little puzzle game that I would recommend to anyone. I think there's been a mobile version of it made since, so look into that, because I'm going back to Cooler World, I'm going back to Krusty's Super Fun House. Man, I forgot that puzzles are basically my favourite kinds of games of all time, so this has really got me all kinds of enthusiastic, because God, looking at my notes here, here's another one that I've got to put some time in and actually play, because I've only played it a little bit. Antechamber, really fascinating puzzle game. This kind of coming off the heels of the whole Portal thing that happened when kind of Portal changed everything in many ways, but we'll come to that. Antechamber kind of came off the heels of that kind of like scientific, mathematic approach to puzzle games with a fascination in geometric shapes and impossible spaces and objects and things like that. It's another one that's really, really hard to describe, but if you're into your maths and your geometry and things like that and just strange mind-bending shapes, then that's all going on through Antechamber, and that's absolutely up my street. I know my brother played a fair amount of this game, and I never gave it the time it deserved because I don't own it on my Steam. Am I going to have to remedy that tonight? I think I'm going to have to remedy that tonight, because we're staying quite chilled out here in the second half of the show with this tune from Siddhartha Barnhoon. I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing that one wrong, but that is a fun name. And a track called Black Tile. picking it up with some intense beats there for the very end of the show. You Can't Escape, You Know, by Mike Muraski from, of course, Portal. We couldn't talk about puzzle games without coming to Portal. They already snuck in there a little bit while we were talking about Antechamber, but here we are, full force in the world of thinking about portals right at the end of the show. This game was a complete and utter revelation to me when I played through it for the very first time on a borrowed PS3. I'd never played anything like it, and I think that might maybe speak to the closeted lifestyle I was living when I was younger, but still, it completely changed the game for me and just gave me a unending hunger for that kind of game, which is why when Portal 2 eventually hit the shelves, it was a complete and utter event for my brother and I continue to be satisfied by the perpetual testing initiative where that allows users to make their own test chambers, and continued mods and all of this kind of thing that allow us to play with this kind of puzzle. And we've got another track to play from the Portal franchise, something from Portal 2, to completely finish up the show soon, but we've still got a couple of things to cover before we end things. First off, before I reveal exactly what my top 5 was and the order in which it came, I think it's about time that I acknowledge the many puzzle games that didn't quite make the cut today, and do myself a little walk of shame.
Dr. Mario, Klax, Lumines, Puyo Puyo, Puzzle Bobble, Gunpei, Minesweeper, Boulder Dash, Adventures of Lolo, Intelligent Cube, otherwise known as Karushi, Limbo, Load Runner, Pushover, Sheep, Dog and Wolf, Talos Principle, World of Goo, Big Brain Academy,
Unfortunately, they can't all make the cut, and it's true that these, as I always say, are very, very personal top 5s. Hey, we can't play all the games out there, but this is my experience of puzzle games, and also thrown in alongside a few that I felt had to be mentioned. And I'll be trying to keep up the walk of shame for future shows as well, because it was something that ate at me with almost every edition of the Sound Test Live. When I would come away, whenever we did a central topic, that is, I would come away thinking, man, all of these absolute classics that didn't even get any kind of a mention. I always felt so much shame and so much guilt. So that's exactly what that little walk's about, and allows me to tie up some of those loose ends. But allow me to leave you in suspense no longer and finally give you my definitive top 5 puzzle games from today's playlist and see how everybody did today. In number 5, we have Lemmings. For number 4, Cooler World. For number 3, another type of world entirely, an odd world. Number 2, a dual entry, and I'll admit that this is a bit of a cheat, so if you chose either of these, you get it. The Witness and Braid. And finally, obviously taking the top spot, Portal, and that is exactly why we're going to hear 2 tracks from it today. And we've already heard one. It was the very ending track when you're having the big final battle with GLaDOS, and we're going to hear the very final big boss battle track from Portal 2 now, because I'm very glad to play some Mike Muraski stuff that's completely separate from any of the songs, the Jonathan Colton stuff, which is usually the path that I go down because they're nice radio friendly songs. But no, let's hear some more of Mike Muraski's electronic magnificence that pumps through both of those games, although of course he shared that first soundtrack with Kelly Bailey, who was best known for his work on Half-Life. And the track that we're going to hear now is called Bombs for Throwing at You, and it's a seriously intense one, just like the last one we heard. Absolutely incredible, full of intense programmed beats and crunching melodies. But one final thing I'd like to mention before we jump into that and tie up this puzzle show for well and good is to mention about the Colin Anderson Grand Theft Auto interview, which I was talking about so passionately on my last Gangster special. That is very much coming probably in just a couple of weeks' time. I have now actually conducted that interview. It unfortunately had to get pushed back, but we have now done it. Ended up to be about an hour long. So the chances are that I'm probably not going to put that into one of my top 5s. I'll probably release that as its own specific bonus in about a couple of weeks' time, once I've been able to edit it up with some music and everything. We all know how much I love Grand Theft Auto, and Colin gave me such a great interview when we talked about a week ago, so I want to give that as much justice as I can. So look forward to that, Grand Theft Auto fans. It's a really, really interesting one. And until then, I guess I'm just going to have to give you some bombs for throwing at you.